So, hello everybody. My name is Natalie Cohn. Sorry, Natalie Davidson. I'm giving my maiden name came out all of a sudden. I'm a lecturer at Tel-Aviv University, and I'd like to welcome you all to what promises to be a fascinating discussion about how government officials, and in particular government lawyers, should behave in a unjust or evil political regime. So we're honored today to host Professor David Luban, who will give us a presentation titled Complicity and Lesser Evils, A Tale of Two Lawyers. His presentation will last about 25 minutes, after which our colleague and friend Smadar Ben-Natan, can we already say Dr. Ben-Natan? Who just handed in her dissertation. You're on mute, Smadar. Okay. Smadar.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Smadar Ben-Natan will respond for about 10 minutes, and afterwards we will open to the public for questions. And before going any further, I'd like to say that members of the audience will be able to ask questions in two ways. You can ask a question by raising your hand in the participant area of Zoom. You raise your hand on Zoom, I'll see you, I'll call on you, and you can ask your question through the microphone. If you prefer, you can also submit your questions in writing through the chat. But in order for us to all remain focused on the presentations, if you're going to ask a question through chat, I ask that you wait until the two main presentations are finished, or at least towards the end of Smadar Ben-Natan's presentation, so that we're not bombarded with questions from the outset. I'd like to briefly introduce our distinguished speakers today, give just a bit more detail, and then Professor Liora Bilski, the director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights, who is organizing and hosting this event, will give a few words of welcome. But first of all, for those of you who don't know Professor David Luban, he's university professor in law and philosophy at Georgetown University. He's distinguished chair in ethics at the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, U.S. Naval Academy. He writes widely on international criminal law, as many of the Tel Aviv University students who are here know. He writes on professional ethics and just war theory as well. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and a Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University. He has held visiting chairs at the Fordham, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale Law Schools, and has taught at the Interdisciplinary Center, Dartmouth College, and the University of Melbourne. His books include Torture, Power, and Law by Cambridge University Press, Lawyers and Justice, An Ethical Study by Princeton University Press, Legal Ethics and Human Dignity by Cambridge, and Legal Modernism by University of Michigan Press. Smadar Ben-Natan is an Israeli human rights lawyer. She recently completed her PhD at Tel Aviv University and has just begun a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her research in law and society focuses on the intersection of human rights, criminal justice, national security, and international law. She has published about Israeli military courts in Israel, Palestine, about torture, human rights beyond state borders, and has a forthcoming article discussing the co-optation of human rights by Israeli military judges. So before turning to these speakers, I would like to give the microphone handed over to Professor Liora Bilski, Director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, Natalie. I just not to forget, I wrote some things. So on behalf of Minerva Center for Human Rights, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor David Luban for our Zoom meeting to present a very special research on the gray zone of the legal profession. I first heard David's presenting his paper exactly a year ago in a conference that was held in Nuremberg in a time before COVID. So ever since then, I want to talk in Israel with our legal community on his research. We were supposed to hold this meeting in late April together with a special traveling exhibition of the Germany Justice Ministry called the Rosenberg Project, which is a visual presentation of the historical commission into the continuation of Nazi personnel and influence in the post-war era in the German Justice Ministry and legal system. We will certainly hold this exhibition in the post-COVID-19 period. But for now, let me welcome Professor Luban and Dr. Smadar Ben-Natan into what will promise to be a fascinating meeting. I also want to thank Natalie Davidson for agreeing to be the moderator and for Rachel Plaxton, who was behind all of this and made this event possible. So I wish us all a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now turn to Professor Luban's lecture, approximately 25 minutes. Dr. Ben-Natan, 10 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for questions by chat and in person. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I wish that I had been able to be there in person last spring, but obviously circumstances did not allow that. I should say that about a week ago, I was participating in a Zoom conference and was just about to give my talk when literally that second a bolt of lightning knocked out the internet and all the electricity. It was like the closest thing that I've ever experienced to a divinity telling me that what I was going to say was not right. But I'm hoping for good technology today. This talk comes from a longer paper, and for anyone who's interested, just write me offline, and I'd be happy to send you the draft of the paper. It really originated right in the wake of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, when I had a number of students who had been offered government jobs and were trying to decide whether to accept the jobs. I had friends who, conservative friends who had been approached by the transition team to see whether they would want to serve in the new administration. And some friends who were in the government who were wondering whether they would stay in the government. And their question for all of them was, can I stay when I find the incoming administration so problematic, dangerous because of the promises that had been made in the campaign? And I did a blog post called The Case Against Serving. And my wife told me that I was completely out of my mind, that anyone who would try to uphold the rule of law ought to stay in government service. So I did what I think any sane person would do getting such strong advice, which was it was time to think harder about the issue and see whether I could, whether she was right or whether there was something to my original reaction. So the opportunity came, as Leora mentioned, to write about this subject in the context of a conference on writing desk perpetrators, Schreibtischtäter, that was being held in Nuremberg. And I'm going to put some slides up, and hopefully this comes up. Yeah. Can everybody see this? Okay. So this is a term that is not well known among English speakers. It's become a very common idiom in Germany, because of the German coming to grips with the Shoah, coming to grips with the war. I think the Eichmann trial had a lot to do with the term. So, a desk perpetrator, the best definition that I've seen actually comes from C.S. Lewis, the British writer, who writes that the greatest evil now done is conceived and ordered in clean, carpeted, warmed, well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. Now, I think it's an image that we all recognize, but the question that was on my mind was, is it possible by staying on the job to become the opposite of a desk perpetrator, namely a desk mitigator? So a desk mitigator would be somebody who stays on to fight the good fight and do the lesser evil. And of course, this is a very morally compromising position to be in, because to stay in might mean that you're perpetrating some things in order to mitigate others. Now, I began to think very hard about some essays by Hannah Arendt, who actually wrote a wonderful essay called Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship on just the subject that I was thinking about. And this is not about Eichmann in Jerusalem and the banality of evil. The essays were written afterwards, and they were very personal reflections on what it was like in the early days of the Third Reich, when suddenly she found herself being betrayed, not by her enemies. I mean, they wouldn't, that wouldn't be treason, but by friends who little by little were getting used to the new regime and saying, well, maybe it's not so bad, and you must admit he's doing a few good things. And in any case, if I stay on my job, I can keep it on track. Well, I am going to have to stop seeing you because you're a Jewish friend, and it would be awkward. This kind of thing. And Arendt thought of this as the dress rehearsal for the horrors to come later. I mean, it was the moment at which human judgment began to break down, and in which judgment that something is really bad changes to the judgment that it's not quite so bad. And she had an explanation for this. She thought these were people are putting their finger up to the winds of history, and the winds of history are blowing Hitler's way. And who am I to resist that? And so they kind of got onto the bandwagon. And she was very unforgiving to people who stayed on in the regime, even those who thought they were going to do the lesser evil. First of all, to those who said, well, I did these things, but I was an inner emigrant. I'm not somebody this was against my convictions. And her reaction's very straightforward. What matters is not your inner convictions, but your outer actions. And what she writes again and again, obedience is support. If you're going along, you're actually supporting the regime. Now, why would that be? Well, in part, I mean, it seems to me there are two moral dangers that are both there. The first of them is your own corruption, that you yourself, and showing up at the office every day, doing this work, seeing that actually the people that you're working with aren't such bad folks after all. I mean, they're career civil servants. You actually think that they're excellent. Of course, there are these party fanatics that are down the hall, but they just reinforce the sense that we're actually a pretty good team here. And eventually your own judgment gets corrupted. But the second danger is that I think obedience and support really gets at is that you are contributing to the corruption of their judgment, because just as you're looking at them and saying, wait, is this proposal that we're talking about today, is this normal or not? And you don't see anybody objecting and you think, well, maybe it's normal. They're looking at you and thinking the same thing, so that there is a kind of mutual normalizing of the abnormal, and that is that's the collapse of judgment. And Arendt's view was you just have to get out. And let me put this in the form of maxims, or rules of thumb, which Arendt herself was not somebody who believed in rules as the guide to morality, but I think if we think of these simply as rules of thumb, first, don't participate. Nobody is asking you to be a hero and a martyr, but you don't have to keep your job. You don't have to do this work. You can just go home. Second, don't dodge responsibility by protesting that inwardly you are an opponent, because inwardly doesn't count. Third, don't justify participation by saying that, well, if I quit, the next person is going to be worse. You don't know that. And in the meantime, there is what you yourself are doing. Don't deceive yourself into thinking you're going to keep your moral judgment intact. Chances are you'll be changed. Don't say, well, I at least was taking responsibility. Well, the fact that you're shouldering guilt doesn't make you any less guilty. And finally, don't mistake rule following for morality. You must think and judge for yourself. Now, these are pretty strongly worded rules. She objects to herself, well, maybe this is germ-proof moralism, that maybe you have to get your hands dirty. And I thought this was an impossible thing to think about in the abstract. So I took case studies of two German lawyers, both of whom are relatively well known to historians. Both of them stayed on the job. Both of them claimed to be resistors. Both of them claimed, probably correctly, to have saved lives. And I wanted to do a kind of double case study, moral biography of these two. So the first one is, let me get the screen back up. Bernhard Lösner. Lösner was a lawyer in the Interior Ministry in the Third Reich. He was more than that. He was the specialist on the Jews in the Interior Ministry, which means that in reality, he was the specialist on the persecution of the Jews. He was a Nazi Party member from 1930. He, among other things, wrote the Nuremberg Laws, or helped to write the Nuremberg Laws. Let's see. Now, he did a memoir in 1950, in which it's a kind of self-vindication, explaining that he hated what he was doing every second, and then talking about the steps that he took as a bureaucrat to be a rescuer. There is a great deal of question about how much of this is a kind of self-vindication, whitewash. But I think that some of the main events, which I'll review in a moment, are true. There are other documents as well. He testified at the Nuremberg trial of his boss, and there's an interrogation of him that's in the Yad Vashem archives. So he is, I mean, he is the Nazi. The second, Helmut James von Moltke, was the anti-Nazi. He's much better known. It's a famous military name. His ancestors were chief of staff of the German army. And from the very beginning, he was an anti-Nazi. And nevertheless, he went into the government with the war. He went into military intelligence, into the International Law Department, and he stayed there. At the same time, he was organizing a group of anti-Hitler resistors, which at his family home in Kreisau, where it was called the Kreisau Circle by historians, who were planning how are we going to restore democracy after the war is lost and after Hitler is gone. He was after the July 20th bomb plot, when the Gestapo then unwound the resistance circles. He was executed. He was tried in front of the People's Court. I guess I should say this last slide, the upper right-hand picture, is of a picture of Moltke at his trial in the People's Court, where he was sentenced to death, and he was executed atrociously just 3 weeks before the judge who condemned him was blown up. Now, we know a lot about him because he wrote on an almost daily basis to his wife, Freya. And those letters are collected in there, I should say, incredibly moving letters. And I'll just say one word about Freya von Moltke, who had a very long life. She came eventually to the United States, and she spent her, the entire rest of her life publicizing Moltke's own legacy of resisting in dark times. So, I think another good talk could be about the career of Freya von Moltke. Now let's turn to Lösner. Here's his story. He gets a call saying there is going to be a rally at Nuremberg, and Hitler wants to announce big pieces of legislation. They're not drafted yet. Would you get on a plane tonight or tomorrow morning? This gets the call at 11 at night. Go to Nuremberg. Prepare to do the drafting. And for the next 2 days, his story is we went through multiple drafts. There were party radicals in the room who I was fighting, and I was fighting to make the Nuremberg Laws as lenient as possible, and I more or less won. That's his story. Now, his motivations. So he said that he was a Nazi, but he was not an anti-Semite. And I think that this is probably not true that he was not an anti-Semite, but I think that he was anti-persecution. So this is a kind of peculiar mental space to be in, to have he believed in the race theory. But persecuting the other race was something that for him, he said, was a step too far. So this is the rally. And I'd like to just review what the Nuremberg Laws were that he drafted. There's first the Reich Citizenship Law, which strips citizenship from non-Aryans and creates a new second-class status of a state member, or sometimes translated as a national, or somebody who belongs to the state. The second, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, it made it a crime for Jews and nationals of German or related blood to be married. It criminalized sexual relations between Jews and nationals of German or related blood, and it installed other persecutions. Now, what was Lösner doing in the drafting? He was fighting over the definition of who was a Jew and who was a mixed race, Mischling. So before this, in the May law or the April laws of 1933, a Jew was defined to be anyone with a single Jewish grandparent. So a quarter Jew was a Jew and was then expelled from the civil service. Now at Nuremberg, the proposals, the one from the party radicals was that one Jewish great-grandparent would be sufficient to classify somebody as a Jew. Julius Streicher, who was the most appalling of all the Jew haters and Jew baiters in the Third Reich, one drop of Jewish blood. And this was modeled on US race laws, which the Nazis had carefully studied. Now, Lisner's compromise was that it would take 3 Jewish grandparents to make somebody a full Jew. Fewer than that would make them a Mischling. And then the battles that he fought, both then and in the regulations afterwards, can we restrict the persecutions to full Jews and exempt the Mischlinge? And he won some of these battles. He lost some of the battles. So the rest of his story is that his job became more and more dangerous. In 1941, he discovered the facts of the murder of the Jews, and he requested a transfer, which was granted. He said to his boss, "There's a judge within that doesn't allow me to do this." After the bomb plot, he shelters one of the plotters. He himself is arrested, and if the war hadn't ended, he would have been executed. Now, there's a great deal of debate about how much of this to believe, but I think that the basic facts are correct. He did fight to have the Nuremberg laws applied to as few people as possible. He was in danger. He did request the transfer and get out of the job. And he was arrested by the end of the war. Now, where did his moral convictions come from? Well, he said, they came from pure ethics and from religion. But I think that he, from a lawyer's point of view, a more interesting fact is that he actually believed that the Nuremberg laws would be the end of things, that they would protect Jews from persecution by officials who were running wild, and that it was in spite of the Nuremberg laws rather than because of them that the persecutions of the Jews were there, which I think is complete psychological stupidity on his part. The idea that enshrining racism in law is going to limit it rather than simply enabling it, I think just shows a kind of lawyer's fairy tale faith in the power of law. He had the bureaucrat's conservatism, and at one point when he was talking about why I kept the job, he said, "It was Providence who brought me into this job to fight this good fight." He refers to a providential commission from a higher authority. And to me, it means that his self-understanding, assuming that we accept his religious and ethical views as true, is I'm a bureaucrat in the interior ministry of heaven, brought to earth. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn to Moltke. It's a much simpler story because he was always a resistor. And what we find from his letters and other documents is that from Moltke, Moltke was constantly fighting legal battles. And he's getting outvoted 25-1 and going over the heads of the committee and pleading with his boss to change things, and sometimes winning, sometimes reversing terrible orders, but always with this sense of being completely morally compromised. And I'd like to just give you a couple of, sorry, I'm going to come back to this. Moltke's letter in 1941, after he's been outvoted at a meeting, and somebody says, "What are you fighting for? It's all a lost cause." And he says, I appreciate the charm and qualities of these men, but their actions have no moral basis. They're like chameleons. In a healthy society, they look healthy. In a sick one like ours, they look sick, but actually they're nothing but filler. Later, the day is so full of gruesome news that I cannot write in peace. How is one to bear the burden of complicity? All this is child's play compared with what's happening in Poland and Russia. May I know this and yet sit at my table, have tea? Don't I thereby become guilty too? What shall I say when I'm asked, and what did you during that time? If I could get rid of the terrible feeling that I've let myself be compromised. Why does he keep the job? There have been great criminals everywhere, but it is the inescapable duty of all the righteous to keep crime within bounds, and whoever evades this task is more guilty than the criminal himself. And well, I don't know about that last, and now I think one of the most terrifying letters. Russian prisoners, evacuated Jews, Russian prisoners, hostages shot, gradual encroachment in the Reich of measures tried and proved in the territories. Again, evacuated Jews, Russian prisoners, a mental home for SS men who broke down, executing women and children. That was the world of these 2 days. Yesterday, I said goodbye to a once famous Jewish lawyer who will kill himself with his wife today because he has to be picked up tonight. And yet, I was actually able to throw a spanner in the works, obstructing a bit at least of the persecution of the Jews, which proves the general rule that as soon as one man takes a stand, a surprising number of others will stand too, but there always has to be one to go first. Otherwise, it does not work. Now, this takes me to one of the themes, and that is a theme about how much maneuvering room, and I'm going to go back a couple of slides, how much maneuvering room does an official have for protest, pushback, and resistance? How far can you go without losing your job or losing your neck? And for this, I picked the German word Spielraum, which means scope or wiggle room, or in engineering, the tolerance for going back and forth in a piece of precision machinery. How much Spielraum does an official have? That's a guiding question for assessing both of these men. And that last quote, I think, shows that there's a way in which an official might be able to make his own Spielraum. So let's take stock of these men. It's interesting to try to think about them comparatively. I find actually Lösner to be a more instructive case than Moltke, precisely because Lösner was far more morally compromised. Moltke was, by all accounts, more or less a saint. George Kennan, a US diplomat who knew him in the days after the war had begun, but before the United States entered, and wrote in his memoirs, "I consider Moltke to have been the greatest person morally and the largest and most enlightened in his concepts that I met on either side of the battle lines in the Second World War," which makes him an interesting yardstick by which to measure lesser mortals. But the question is, how about the lesser mortals? I think that the overall answer is, look, Lösner claims that he saved between 20,000 and 100,000 lives. And Moltke, it's not clear how many he saved, but it is clear that he saved a significant number of lives. And it seems to me that the germ-proof moralist that Hannah Arendt accuses herself of being really has to say, no, wait, the consequences really do matter. Whether you are a consequentialist in your moral theory or not, I think there is no moral theory in which consequences don't matter. I do think that you must be very careful in considering what those consequences are. So let me take Lisner's example. He says that he saved 20,000 lives. How does he know that? What he does know is that he's managed to change the classification of 20,000 people, or on other laws, 100,000 people. But what actually happened to those people in real life, given that the other thing that he knew, and that he talks about repeatedly, is that his higher ups, Hitler and Himmler, Heydrich, other opponents, have utter contempt for the rules, and we're going to ignore the rules. So is this just a lawyer's faith going into the calculation of consequences? So he probably as well overestimated what the effect was of his own advocacy. Even in the cases where he said, I won the battle, we don't know that it was his advocacy that made the difference, and he didn't know that either, because he's working in a very, very Baroque bureaucracy. Plus, he is the Jewish expert. There are these episodes, of course, where he says, yes, I fought the fight. What was he doing the rest of the time? If you're going to look at consequences, you have to look at the daily evils that he never records in the memoirs, as well as whatever the good was. And finally, did he contribute to normalizing wrongdoing in the eyes of others? Now, so what I want to say is that even if you take the consequences into account, and even if your all things considered judgment is that these men should have stayed on the job, there's still the question of how culpable they are for complicity with the actual wrongs that they had to do. And for this, I want to use a set of criteria for judging complicity. What I call the moral remainder that I took from a terrific book by Chiara Lepora and Robert Gooden called On Compromise and Complicity, who say that the first question to ask is, how bad is the principal wrongdoing that you are complicit in? And here, for both of them, the principal wrongdoing is complete atrocity. So there's no exoneration there. Did they know what they were doing? Were they doing it voluntarily? In both cases, the answer is yes. What's their causal role in the principal wrongdoing? This is more complex because, on the one hand, Lisner's causal role was direct. He did help to draft the Nuremberg Laws, and he did help to draft the various implementing decrees. At the same time, the laws probably would have been worse had he not had his hand in it. So I don't think these things cancel each other out. How about aims and purposes? Well, Moltke's was pure. Lisner's were mixed. He was, I think his beau ideal would have been a kind of apartheid society in Germany. And although Lepora and Gooden don't talk about it, what do we know about their characters? And I think that both of them were courageous. Both of them were religious. And I think that is something that that is worth thinking about. But apart from that, Lisner, I think, has a very cramped lawyer's view. Now, should they have quit? I can see four arguments for quitting the job. One is that they couldn't do any good by staying, so that would be unmitigated evil, which was not true for either of them. That quitting in protest might inspire others to resist. I don't think there's any evidence that that's true. If you don't quit, your judgment will be corrupted. That's the theme I've been most impressed with, but it seems to me that in fact, their judgment wasn't corrupted. Are they corrupting others' judgment? That may very well be. So, but it may not. I mean, that is, we have no evidence. So on the whole, it seems to me that they made the right decision by staying on the job. Now, let me finish by drawing some lessons from this, and let me put up one more slide. The first is that I think that Hannah Arendt actually was wrong, that lesser-evilism is possible. It doesn't necessarily lead to corrupted judgment and moral collapse, but it requires Spielraum. And in both of their cases, what turned out to be really important was they had allies on the job. And that means that if somebody is considering this question, should I stay or quit, they have to do a very realistic assessment of how much Spielraum they have. And they have to see whether they have allies, because without allies, they'll accomplish nothing. Now, my conjecture is that if they are actually trying to do something to accomplish lesser evils, that acting in public helps to keep their own moral judgment firm. That, I think, was very clear from Moltke's letters, that it was fighting his fights that made him more and more committed to continuing to fight the fights. But the most important one, and this is the place in which I think Hannah Arendt really has her finger on the truth. Unless you actually are doing something on the job, then you can't claim to be a mitigator. And then really you must quit. And I'd like to close by talking about why you might think, well, of course that's banal. Of course you have to do something, but you might get caught in the effectiveness trap. This is a phrase that was coined by an American writer in an article in 1968 about the Vietnam War. This man was the first United States government official who resigned in protest of the war. In 1966, 2 years before that, he had helped draft the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the war and really kicked it off. So he was the Bernhard Lösner of the Lyndon Johnson administration. And he defines the effectiveness trap this way. So it's that the most important asset that you have as a bureaucrat is your effectiveness, and you want to preserve it. So the inclination is, I'm going to hold my fire now. I'm not going to fight this fight because the most important fight might be coming up. But of course, what really happens is that as the years go on, you're always holding your fire. You're never fighting that fight. And it's the trap that keeps you from speaking out. It's the trap that keeps you from resigning. And it's the trap that makes it clear that you are not the mitigator that you hope to be. So that's it. I've gone a bit over on the time, but that's the professor's way. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Luban. We now turn to Dr. Smadar Ben-Natan for a response, and after which we'll take questions.
All right, thank you, David, for this incredibly moving, beyond everything talk, and for the chance to reread you and your wonderful writing and your carefully crafted research, and you are such an inspiration. And thank you, Natalie and Leora and Rachel, for organizing this, this event. I'll respond in the short time that I got to David's paper on two levels. So one level is the main level with which David and Hannah Arendt deal with, which is ethics and personal morality and judgment. And the second level that I want to touch on is what can this discussion teach us on a theory of the state? Because I think that the term you use, David, of Spielraum, is extremely important to questions of the state and state actions and how to achieve social and political change within the state structure. So on the first level, David draws a very controversial conclusion that some lawyers that work for the Third Reich nevertheless did right morally and professionally, as careful as this assessment might be. And while I agree with you on the conclusion as to the two cases that you discuss, I feel, and you point that out in the beginning of your paper, that these are extraordinary stories, that their character and their exceptional resilience in maintaining their moral integrity while on the job is not unusual and not necessarily representative. And they might bring you to conclusions that should be slightly maybe qualified to include other cases as well. Now, of course, you don't say that lesser-evilism is the right way to go, that everyone should do that. Of course, there's a question of conscience, and people who don't do that because they cannot conscientiously belong to such a system. I think we all agree that they certainly make the right choice. But you say that there are cases where lesser-evilism could be justified, and that is under certain conditions, and I want to touch on these conditions. And some of these might rephrase what you say, but some of it might add to this. So the point is that there are many other stories that are not exactly like the one you told us today, but you told us these other stories before in your previous work on the torture lawyers from Washington. So David wrote a magnificent article about the lawyers in the US administration who had drafted the torture memos that justified the US torture program. And they actually, you showed there how these lawyers crafted the position of the state that allowed for both gross atrocities and illegal positions. And in that story, they were mitigators, but these mitigators were sidestepped or ignored. And you wrote there in the torture lawyers that legal critics, I quote you, legal critics within the administration had been allowed to think that they were engaged in a meaningful process, but their deliberations appeared to have been largely an academic exercise, or worse, a charade. I end the quote. So when we try to generalize from these, your current two stories to a more general point, I think there are other variants that we might take into account. So first of all, I already said most people would not be as resilient to moral corruption and judgment when working with these systems as Drosser and Moltke were. Second of all, we are discussing here mid-level bureaucrats. And mid-level bureaucrats exercise influence, some influence at least. And some of the possibility of influence would not be true for more lower level participants. So for example, if I take the Israeli context, young people who choose to enlist to the military thinking that they will change from within and exert influence because they would be nice to Palestinians in the checkpoints, I think this thought is more illusionary, and the chances of corruption in that situation are more real. Third, even with mid-level bureaucrats, like what are the possibilities of actual effectiveness? And you pointed to that. In many cases, dissenting voices are being silenced or just merely taken out of the room and excluded from exerting influence. And fourth, there is the possibility of making a loud resignation, so making a statement by resigning. And this possibility involved great risks in Nazi Germany, but it is more available in less extreme regimes, and I think it should always be considered against the possibility of staying. And you give the example of Thompson, and I think we could also think of Edward Snowden as an example of a very loud resignation with some other things that he did in that context. And fifth, I think you present a historical research where, of course, you judge these actions in hindsight. But in the present, when we are facing many uncertainties and conditions might change and unfold, the task of judgment should be ongoing and constant. So someone might have joined the government with the thought that they would make influence, but 2 years have gone by and nothing real was did, it might be a good time to reconsider that initial choice, and that choice should be again and again reconsidered as events unfold and as experience is being gained. So what I'm trying to say here is that the choice to stay or to quit is not a one-time decision, but an ongoing evaluation of costs and benefits and moral corruption as events unfold. And it is also not a binary question. So it matters not only if you stay or if you quit, but how do you stay and how do you quit if you choose to do that. So now I want to move to the second part, and this is asking what can we learn from this discussion on a theory of the state. So Drosser and Moltke were officials of their governments, and although they were not representative of their government positions, they were part of the government apparatus and of government action. And this is particularly astounding when you bring us these stories from the Third Reich, from Nazi Germany, that we would think of as the paradigmatic example of a monolithic government, and showing us that after all, it was not that monolithic. So taking that point, while Max Weber famously referred to bureaucracy as the iron cage of humanity, arguing that it is tremendously efficient and powerful means of controlling people in its rational organizations. Your stories demonstrate to us that bureaucracy might not be as iron as Weber has put it, and there might be a lot of Spielraum within the cage, within the iron cage, to take individual action by officials within their role, and to demonstrate agency. So we are in the tension between structure and agency, the structure of the regime, the structure of the government, the bureaucracy, against the ability of individuals to take action. And you tell us, David, that there is room for agency even in the most atrocious and deadly bureaucracies, since they are all managed by human beings. And if this is the case in Nazi Germany, it is all the more so in other governments. So in my own research, I studied a military court inside Israel that prosecuted only Palestinian citizens of Israel on security offenses until 2000. And in 2000, that court was closed down by a decision of a single military lawyer, Ilan Schiff, who was then the president of the Military Courts of Appeal. And like you say, when someone makes the first step, other people follow, but someone has to make that first step. And that career military lawyer for his entire life made the judgment call to close down that court because he thought that was not right to have a court only for Palestinian citizens. And of course, there are multiple explanations. There's never a single cause to an event of that sort. But in the end, there is the person in the official position that makes the decision. And I think your presentation really highlights that. And I think without the action of that person in 2000, we would have had this court for many years after 2000. It would have persisted without his agency and without his decision. I want to take another example, very short, of an argument, this time stressing structure over agency. And I want to share my screen for a minute. This is a photo. Do you see that? Do you see the photo?
No, you haven't shared.
So let me try again, just 1 second. Okay, yeah. Now?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, good. So this photo was taken in the demonstrations now currently happening against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I credit Alon Marcus for taking this photo. And the sign reads, "It does not matter who the Prime Minister is in an apartheid state." So I think the sign has a point, but the statement seemed to me to be wrong. It does matter who is a Prime Minister in an apartheid state. Prime ministers, it might be hard for us to think about it at the moment, but Prime Minister can end apartheid. And it really matters who they are to the question whether they do it or not. So when we are looking for cracks in the state and in the government that might create change, the identity and the characters of the persons involved is extremely important. It is true, and this is the important message of this sign that is directed more at other demonstrators than at the government, that when there is corruption and there is also apartheid, you should protest apartheid and not only corruption. But I do wish to say that it matters who the Prime Minister is. So in closing, I want to return to, okay, I want to say something else.
We have to wrap up though, Smadar, so just a minute.
Yeah. So I want to say that there are many theories who are talking about the disaggregated state, the state that is comprised of many organizations and many interest groups that pull and push, but the state is disaggregated also because there are human beings within it that take action. So in closing, I want to return really shortly to Hannah Arendt and to her chapter that you were referring to. So Arendt does argue that obedience is support, but not because if you obey, that means that you support. She ends the chapter with this very strong statement that there's no such thing as obedience. So there is no such thing as obedience in moral and political matters. And I think we should understand the statement with a metaphor that she briefly opens the chapter with. So she writes, and I quote, "There is a widespread conviction that to be tempted and to be forced are almost the same. Whereas, in the words of Mary McCarthy," she then gives the quote, "If someone points a gun at you and says, 'Kill your friend or I will kill you,' he is only tempting you. That is all." So I think what it means is that there are always options, that the person holding the gun might not intend to act on their statement, on their threat, or that they might fail to do it, or they're just testing you, but there's always space and there's always options. And I think in this sense, she is creating or referring to the same Spielraum that you were talking about, that it's not a question of obedience. There's always Spielraum, and obedience is just an excuse. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Smadar. Professor Luban, would you like to very briefly respond, or do you want to move directly to the questions?
I think given that we don't have that much time, perhaps we can move directly to the questions. But let me just say that Smadar, thank you for these incredibly useful comments. And actually, let me say something in response to just one, and that is when the important point you make about how lower level people might not have as much option to make a difference as they think they do. It brought to mind a conversation that I had with a student back in 2016, a former student who was trying to decide whether to accept a job in the new Justice Department. And we had a long talk about it. And afterwards he said, I sent some of your article, your blog post, to my brother, who wrote back and said, "I think that you're a better person than Hannah Arendt thinks you are." So, this was the kind of level of ex-ante deliberation of the young person going into the post.
Thank you. So I'll take a first question from the chat from Limor Zer-Gutman. She asks, David, does the fact that the person is a lawyer, does that make a difference? Because lawyers, the legal profession generally have an obligation to the rule of law and to society. And I have to admit, this is a question that I myself wanted to ask. Is there something, should we conduct the analysis somewhat differently if we're talking about lawyers in comparison with other government officials?
Yeah. And I'm off mute, aren't I? Yeah. Okay. You know, that I'm not sure that that lawyers are in a special position vis-a-vis other government officials, because the idea that lawyers have a special commitment to the rule of law, which, let me just grant that as an assumption. I mean, the rule of law can be complicated, as it was in Nazi Germany, where the official jurisprudence of the Third Reich was to say that, you know, the law should not be interpreted formalistically. So the criminal code in the Third Reich adds a new first clause saying that everything subsequently should be interpreted in light of healthy folk feeling, folk sentiment, which everybody knew meant what the parties interpreted along the party line. So what does commitment to the rule of law mean if the rule of law is viewed through the lens of an anti-formalist, purposive jurisprudence, where the jurisprudence itself is part of the evil? In that case, is it a commitment to reading the rules narrowly and upholding them against the regime, or is the commitment to the rule of law interpreting them the way that the regime wants you to interpret them? I don't have a pat answer to that question, but I think but the conclusion I want from it is that that the lawyer's mere commitment to the rule of law by itself can't be content neutral as to what the law says. Rule of law as such can be good, it can be evil. So the commitment has to be something, I think, outside the rule of law. Now, are lawyers in a better position or a worse position than in other professions? Well, I think that just to take my own personal contrast point, because I do have a job in a military academy as in the ethics center. There is, at least among officers who are, you know, committed to civilian control of the military, a very strong ethos saying that you don't have much Spielraum, that even if you feel the need to act, that you would be undercutting one of the defining values of the military. Now, of course, lawyers have a defining value of loyalty to the client, but when the government is the client, that's not so easy to analyze. But you know, it may be that lawyers do have more experienced capacity of agency, Spielraum, than do military officers, for example. But I don't think lawyers are special kinds of officials.
And Smadar, would you like to, do you have a response here? Should lawyers approach in any different way the question of should I stay or should I go than other government officials in your view?
Well, I agree with David that being a lawyer doesn't mean that you are necessarily committed to the rule of law and its substantive, you know, meaning, and you would do a better job in, you know, in resisting. It's a matter of character and morals. But I do think there's a difference for those who do want to make a difference. So if we start from the second starting point, someone who does have the moral conviction to do something as a lawyer, you have a professional tool in your toolkit, the legal principles, the principles of the rule of law and also of interpretation and other, like you have a yardstick that you can work with that I'm not sure how other professions have. So I haven't researched other professions, but from the view of the legal profession, I think that we have this toolkit of like an external and objective yardstick that we could make use of.
Yeah. And if I could add just one more thing to this, I've talked with a number of people who were relatively high-ranking national security lawyers in the United States government. We said, look, we couldn't, we're lawyers, we don't shape policy or create it, but we were in the position where we are asked whether it's legal or not. And if we had vetoed it, it wouldn't have happened. So that's a lot of power, but of course that's power that's not available to the low-level lawyer, maybe not even to the mid-level lawyer, but only to somebody who is in the position of, let's say, general counsel to the National Security Council, or the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department.
Thank you. We have a question from Chaim Abraham, who I believe is joining us from England. Is that right?
Yes, from Colchester, not too far from London. David, thank you so much for a really fascinating, interesting talk. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about whether your arguments fall more within the realm of virtue or within the realm of obligations. So do public officials in evil regimes would be just virtuous if they considered resigning or consider whether they can have an effect, or do they have an obligation to resign if they reach the conclusion, and they have an obligation to consider whether they're able to have some kind of change for the better, and if they reach the conclusions that they don't, that they have a duty to resign. If that's the latter case, I'm just trying to understand whether we're just focusing on the people who might be hurt by being part of this evil regime, or whether we take into consideration other factors, like people have to have a job to sustain themselves, or maybe not doing that particular job would mean that that will be very detrimental for them in their society. So I'd be happy if you can say just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it might be too facile to say, well, that falls in the realm of excuses, which might possibly be accepted as excuses, but that's not a justification. So I think the conclusion that I reached was that, if one is staying in a job where being in the job is running these two dangers, that first, you are personally participating in evil doing, and second, even if you're not, you are normalizing the work of the regime so that others might be doing evil. The pro lesser-evilism part is, is very conditional. If I find that I have allies, if I find that I have Spielraum, if I actually am trying to make things better, and if I think you gave an example of you're trying, but you always fail. Well, eventually you can't deceive yourself any longer. And in those cases, I'd say that you do have an obligation of quitting. And by obligation, that if you don't quit, you have now made yourself complicit. And this is where I think Arendt's discussion of the inner emigrants is important. You can't say, well, I never supported any of this. I never wanted any of this. It was always against my will. Obedience is support. Now, I think one last thing you asked about, is this obligation or virtue? something that really began to kind of obsess me during the research for this paper, as I was trying to work myself into the heads of these two very different men, was on the level at which character and virtue did seem to matter. But that's just a brief observation.
Thank you. We have a question from Leora. Leora, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'll be brief. David, I do want to push you on the Natalie's question on the specific obligations or thinking differently on lawyers than on ordinary bureaucrats, and I want to bring into the conversation what you kept on describing as normalization. And especially when you are talking about jurisprudence like in the Third Reich, where it is not a formalist, positivist, but asking more from lawyers in their interpretation, we know that what lawyers interpret as the law often is taken by society as what is moral. So this normalization, lawyers have more influence, and how do we take it into account? So I think that I want to bring into the conversation Ernst Frankel's book, The Dual State, where he exactly the example you gave of, okay, maybe the lawyers are able, have Spielraum, and are able to move someone from this category to that category. That happened in the normative state. But immediately when this legal result was announced in the courtroom, then came the other state, the prerogative state, that took this man and killed him anyhow. So on the one level, this was a legal victory, but immediately when it didn't fit the political reason, so we both have normalization, that laws are still applied and so forth, but the results do not change. So, and I didn't see you actually taking this seriously into account. You just count consequences in how many lives. And I think that when we think about lawyers, we have to think structurally about how lawyers normalize a regime, allow us to think that things are okay, allow us to think that what is legal is moral, and so forth. And all the criteria you give are ethical criteria that are not specific to lawyers as public officials. And I think we actually crave for criteria for lawyers taking into account these kind of considerations.
Yeah. So just to this last point, what's unique to lawyers is, of course, that in the machinery of the state, the legal arguments, laws, and regulations are the levers that they have to manipulate. So when I said that lawyers are not different from other officials, I was thinking that from the point of view of affecting the evil that the state is doing, different officials have different levers. I didn't mean to deny that lawyers' levers are in any sense are special. So first of all, they're special because they do put a kind of patina of normality on action in a way that bureaucratic directives might not. And so this is on one hand a negative that you're helping to normalize. On the other hand, it might be the way in which you can actually accomplish some good ends. So I think that rather than in abstraction, let me just give a couple of examples. Moltke, most of what he worked on were issues of law of war compliance. And in the early stages of the war, it were things having to do with economic warfare. Later, it became the treatment of hostages and prisoners of war. we get one letter where he said, today I would have liked to go home. He actually said, I would have liked to go home and read Kant, but instead I had to spend the entire day fighting like a lion for the life of a French officer that the Reichsmarshal would like to take. So this is a legal fight. I have very mixed feelings about this because this is of the extreme power of normalization. But realistically, I think if he saved one life, that's probably more lives than I'll ever save in my career. So this is not something to sneer at. At another point, Moltke says, I did one thing. I managed to delay an order, which means that several 100,000 people who would be sent to forced labor will now have 10 days more of leading a normal life. So this is not saving lives. It's saving 10 days of normality for people. At another point, he says, today I managed to fight an unlawful Führer order successfully. And now there are thousands of women who owe their husbands' lives to the work of your husband. All of these are legal efforts. Now, what does Lersner do? In addition to his lobbying work in crafting the laws, there are places where in the commentaries that he's writing in an administrative law technical journal, he manages to seed in some things that could conceivably be used by officials to get a less evil outcome. He'll say that under no circumstances is any official allowed to persecute Mischling in economic opportunities. Of course, this is the normative state. This is not the prerogative state where in many cases that doesn't matter. But when we think about it, I think my main point is just you can't discount the good that lesser-evilism can accomplish. And I don't think that that being there is the same thing as contributing to normalizing the state itself. I mean, if we ask, well, sure, suppose every lawyer in the entire state resigned noisily. Well, Arendt says that would bring down the state. I mean, but if you know that they're not going to, then it seems to me that you are thrown onto the decisions of personal morality and a very, as objective as you can make a judgment of your personal ability to accomplish anything good by staying on the job.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat here about the links or the similarities between the Nuremberg Laws on the one hand and apartheid laws and legislation in the United States in the 19th century, if you see any similarity between them.
There's a great deal of similarity, at least I've never read the apartheid laws, so I don't, I couldn't do a clause by clause similarity, but there's a fascinating book by the legal historian James Q. Whitman called Hitler's American Model. And what Whitman shows is that in the early days of the Third Reich, the Nazi legal establishment was carefully studying US race laws, and in fact sent a delegation of lawyers to Mississippi and Alabama to do research and talk to people about them. And in fact, that the Nuremberg Laws were in many respects modeled on US race laws. And Whitman shows documents where it's a kind of a Nazi document that gives a state-by-state breakdown of what the laws are. This is what they are in South Carolina. This is what they are in Alabama. So there is a similarity there. the similarity is that the US laws were a model rather than the other way around. Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left. So members of the audience, if you have a question or comment, this is your opportunity.
Well, I want to jump in, if it makes
Yes.
sense. So my question regards the idea of calculating how effective you are in the scenario. And I think, to my understanding, it is exactly against what Arendt is saying, let's say in thinking in moral considerations. And most lawyers, smart lawyers at least, can actually calculate things however they want to and reach the result they wish to achieve. So my question is, if you say something that is wrong, from your perspective, from your morality, your ethics, and you have to play with this, at least to some extent, otherwise you're out of the game, should you do it while calculating?
Yeah. Let's start with thinking and moral considerations, and which is I can't refrain from a small tangent, which is I heard Hannah Arendt speak only once. I was an undergraduate, and I actually didn't know who it was other than some famous person. So my friend took me to hear this famous person give a talk, and of course, she was a very memorable presence, with this kind of tornado of cigarette smoke coming constantly, and I didn't understand a word she said. I mean, it was all above my head. And 7 years later, I read Thinking and Moral Considerations, and I thought this is one of the best things of hers that I've read. And then it dawned on me that it was the same one that I hadn't understood a word of when I was younger. So here, she wants us to ask this question too. This is something that's in Thinking and Moral Considerations. It's in her lectures on moral philosophy. Can I live with myself if I do this thing? So it's a question that comes up in Plato's Gorgias, where Socrates says that it's better to be the victim of injustice than to do injustice. And his adversary Callicles is completely flabbergasted. Of course, this is idiotic. Nobody would think that. And Arendt picks out one line from Socrates' response, that it is better being one, being myself, that I don't want my lyre to be out of tune. Okay, and Arendt says, if I go along with murder, then I have to live with a murderer. Okay, so for her, the question is, if I am thinking, if I'm engaged in the back and forth of inner dialogue, how can I live with that other person? There's a line from Emily Dickinson, oneself behind, or ourself behind ourself, should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment be horror's least. The body borrows a revolver, he bolts the door, or looking a superior specter or more. So this image of being haunted by the specter that is yourself, that's what Arendt is talking about. So this is just a kind of setup for the answer. The kind of thinking she wants would be for this official, seeing what's going on. So go back to Moltke's letter, Russian prisoners, evacuated Jews. How can I live with this? How can I sit there and have tea in my flat? Can I live with myself? Am I living with someone who's complicit with murder? But if you resign don't you have to answer, don't you have to ask the same question? I was in a position where I might have saved some lives, and I didn't do it. Can I live with myself? Can I live with this person who had the chance to do good and didn't out of conscientiousness? I don't think that Arendt believes these questions have algorithmic answers. I mean, they're always open questions, but that's the question that should be asked. And I think that we can't just settle for saying, this is the point at which I have to quit, without first saying, if I quit, can I live with the person who quit just at that point? Now, Lusner says in his memoir, I was constantly thinking about quitting, but my friends, including my Jewish friends who I never lost, said, no, you can't quit, you have to stay there. Did he make the right choice? I don't, that's the question. I mean, Moltke asking himself the same question, and his answer, which was on one of my slides, was that there is an obligation, if you can fight criminality, to stay and fight. That's where the calculation part comes in. It's not that you reduce yourself to a calculating machine. It's that when you're asking, can I live with a person who does this versus that, you have to think realistically what the this is and what the that is. I don't know if does that help?
Well, I think it's a problem. I tell you, I work for the last 10 years as a lawyer, human rights, mainly with refugees. And I saw many judges and justices in the Supreme Court and lawyers that, to my understanding, because of these calculations, really said not just evil or racist, but really stupid things. Really stupid things. So they will be influential in other places, in different times, etc., etc. And this is something that it is very hard to live with. I think for themselves, not just for the lawyer who is losing the case.
Yeah, since you mentioned immigration, there was one point, I think in the second year of the Trump administration, when the Justice Department announced that it was forming a unit that was going to go through the applications for citizenship of millions of people who had gotten US citizenship, looking for flaws in the applications. And it was pretty clear that this was, well, we're going to look for brown people who may have put some falsehood on their application and see if we can get them out of the country. And that was a moment that when I read that, and I thought, well, this is a point at which any decent lawyer who's asked to work in that unit has to make a noisy resignation. But of course, there are things that can be calculated.
Skip some flows, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's another possibility. You're there, you are reviewing applications, you see one that has a flaw in it, and you say, I'm ignoring it. Complete violation, I suppose, of your professional obligation and the rules of the job, but that kind of sabotage, if you have the Spielraum to do it, can you live with yourself if you take yourself out of being able to do that? Assuming that you are doing it.
Thank you. We have reached the end. I just want to ask Smadar if she has any concluding thoughts in response to what you've heard until now.
Well, I might just react to Leora's question and to your really excellent point on the normative state and the prerogative state. So, and also to David's last comments, we're dealing with uncertainties all the time. It's always uncertain what the consequences of your acts would be. So it's always an estimation, and you always have to learn from experience from what already happened, but it's never You can never know. Just like you said, it's not an algorithm. But when there is the prerogative state and the normative state, the prerogative state where the bad things happen, regardless of the law, is outside your realm of influence and is not dependent on what you do and what you don't do. And the normative state, although it is weakened by the prerogative state, is still there. Okay, things still happen on the normative state. So some people would still listen to what the law has to say, although other people are doing the worst things of all. So this is part of the calculation. So the prerogative state is cruel and mean and everything else, but it doesn't cancel the normative state altogether. So this was my point.
Thank you. Professor Luban, any concluding thoughts?
No, just I just want to express my how grateful I am to you for organizing this event, and to Smadar for his really terrific comments, and also to the questioners for asking what I think are just the right questions.
Well, I want to thank our speakers tonight and everyone in the audience who joined us. And I really want to thank somebody who basically organized everything behind the scenes. That's Rachel Klagsburn, who you haven't heard tonight, but without her, none of this would have happened. And we hope to meet you at further events.
One more thing, Natalie. Next week, we are having a wonderful conference on very much the same topic, transitional justice and the crisis of democracy. It's going to take place on the 30th of the first October, and all are very much invited. Very, very interesting group of people. So David, and you are all invited. Thank you.
So goodbye, David, Smadar, everyone, goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.